Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story, the darkest secrets of crime are uncovered and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light. Soft hum of desert wind. A sun-baked Texas plain stretches wide and empty. In the early 1990s, just outside the quiet city of Waco, a community rose from the dust. They called themselves the Branch Davidians, seekers of prophecy and purpose. At their center stood a man who claimed to see beyond the veil, David Koresh. To his followers, he was not a mere preacher. He was a messenger, an interpreter of divine mysteries. To outsiders, he was something far less holy, a man whose promises would collide with the machinery of the state. Koresh spoke of purity, of preparation, of a coming reckoning. In his eyes, the world was a battlefield of faith and corruption. And Mount Carmel, the compound he led, was the last fortress of truth. Before the headlines, before the siege, Vernon Howell was a boy who never felt at home. His search for meaning led him through scripture until he reinvented himself as David Koresh, named after the biblical King David and the Persian ruler Cyrus. It was a name meant to carry destiny, not doubt. He arrived at Mount Carmel with a guitar slung over his shoulder and a Bible under his arm. The existing Branch Davidians were divided. Koresh's charisma quickly filled the cracks. He sang hymns, preached late into the night, and convinced many that he alone could unlock the 7 seals of Revelation. Koresh's sermons promised more than salvation. They offered certainty in uncertain times. America in the late 1980s was restless. Economic shifts, cultural change, a fear that modern life had outpaced moral compass. Koresh tapped into that unease, claiming he could decode the book of Revelation line by line. His followers believed they were chosen. They gave up jobs, homes, and sometimes family ties to live within Mount Carmel's wooden walls. Inside, the air was thick with discipline and devotion. Days were filled with prayer, music, and lessons from their prophet about purity, prophecy, and preparation for an apocalyptic war. To federal agents watching from afar, Mount Carmel was more than a church, it looked like a fortress. Rumors spread, about weapons, about defiance. But to those inside, the building was sacred ground. Every brick, every door, every hymn echoed their conviction that they were living in the final chapter of the Bible. When Koresh spoke, his voice carried the weight of destiny. "We are God's army," he said. "The world may not understand, but heaven does." By 1992, whispers reached law enforcement agencies. Purchases of firearms and ammunition raised alarms. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms began an investigation, not of faith, but of firepower. Television crews picked up the scent, neighbors speculated. For many Americans, the word cult became shorthand for danger, especially after tragedies like Jonestown. And yet, inside Mount Carmel, life continued. Prayers at dawn, lessons by candlelight, music under the Texas stars. Koresh told his followers that persecution was proof of prophecy. "The world always fears what it doesn't understand," he said. Winter turned to early spring. Surveillance increased. Trucks rolled past the compound's dirt road, pretending to be delivery vehicles. Cameras hid in barns and fields. Koresh, ever watchful, sensed the eyes upon him. He warned his followers that the time of testing was near. "We must stand firm," he said. "When Babylon knocks, we do not bow." Every sermon became a rehearsal for confrontation, not because he sought it, but because he believed it was inevitable. Then came the morning that would echo through history, February 28, 1993. Federal agents approached Mount Carmel to serve a warrant. What they expected to be routine became chaos. In moments, confusion turned to gunfire. The standoff had begun. From that day forward, Waco would no longer be the name of a quiet Texan city. It would become a symbol, invoked by believers, skeptics, and governments alike. For weeks, negotiations and prayers crossed the same airwaves. Inside, Koresh preached that the struggle outside was foretold. He claimed he needed time to finish his writings, his interpretation of the 7 seals. Outside, agents waited, uncertain, the eyes of the nation upon them. The compound became a battlefield not of weapons alone but of ideology, between the faith that demanded endurance and the authority that demanded surrender. Recordings from the time reveal a haunting rhythm, calm voices over radios, hymns drifting from loudspeakers, pleas for resolution met with silence. For Koresh's followers, each day was proof of divine testing. For negotiators, it was a countdown they didn't know how to stop. Koresh promised his followers deliverance, not destruction. He told them they would stand vindicated, that the world would finally see the truth of their devotion. Yet outside, the nation saw something else, a leader whose conviction risked everything, and a government uncertain how to respond. Fade to black. The wind carries the sound of distant sirens. Days turned into weeks. The sun bleached the walls of Mount Carmel. Inside, life continued in slow motion, prayer circles, whispered scripture, children's laughter that echoed in empty hallways. Koresh kept teaching, though his tone had shifted. His body was tired, his voice softer now. But his eyes still burned with belief. To his followers, he was not cornered, he was chosen. To the outside world, he seemed trapped by his own prophecy. The cameras rolled day and night, and America watched as ideology and authority stared each other down across the Texas dust. Each follower inside Mount Carmel had a reason to stay, a story that led them there. Some had come seeking peace, others, redemption. Many said Koresh had given their lives purpose. They cooked meals together, read scripture, and waited for his direction. The outside world called it manipulation. Inside, they called it faith. These were not faceless figures. They were families, musicians, builders, dreamers. The line between devotion and control blurred until neither could be seen clearly through the heat and fear. Every day, the phone lines crackled with hope. Federal agents pleaded for release, of people, of reason, of control. Koresh responded with parables, scripture, and promises that God's timing, not theirs, would decide the end. At times, there were breakthroughs. A few children released, brief moments of trust. Then silence again. The rhythm of surrender and defiance repeated, a dialogue no one seemed to understand. Behind every call was a human face, negotiators torn between duty and doubt. Some later said they felt they were speaking to a man trapped between worlds, one spiritual, one doomed to earthly consequence. As the days stretched on, media encampments surrounded the scene. Helicopters buzzed overhead. America tuned in daily, mesmerized and horrified. The narrative fractured. Some saw government overreach, others saw dangerous fanaticism. The truth, as always, lay tangled in the middle. For the Branch Davidians, the cameras were not intrusions but confirmations, proof that prophecy was unfolding before them. In their minds, the book of Revelation was no longer metaphor, it was live broadcast. Inside, food grew scarce. Tempers flared. Some followers began to question whether divine promises could survive earthly hunger. Yet Koresh's hold endured. He reminded them of past prophets who had faced trials before deliverance. He wrote tirelessly, pages of scripture and interpretation filling notebooks. To him, this was the purpose of it all, the final message the world would receive. To federal officials, it was delay. To Koresh, it was destiny. Weeks had become months. Political pressure mounted, public patience waned. The standoff, once a curiosity, had become a question of national competence. Officials debated every move. Inside, the Davidians prayed and waited. Every sunrise felt like both a blessing and a warning. Every nightfall, another page of history written in tension and misunderstanding. The longer it continued, the less anyone knew how to end it without tragedy. April brought storms. The wind carried the weight of something inevitable. Negotiators pleaded for one last peaceful end. Koresh promised to come out when his writings were complete. But time, it seemed, had run out. Authorities prepared for intervention, certain it was the only way to resolve what faith and reason could not. Inside Mount Carmel, the faithful gathered one last time. Outside, armored vehicles rolled into position. Then the silence before history. When the smoke finally cleared, nothing was as it had been. The siege had ended, but not in resolution, only in ruin. Questions outnumbered answers. What truly happened inside? Could it have ended differently? For those who survived, the memories were both sacred and shattering. For the agents who had watched helplessly, it was a scar on conscience. The debate that followed was as fierce as the flames, about freedom, about faith, about the limits of power and belief. Waco became more than a place. It became a symbol, for distrust, for defiance, for the delicate line between religion and rebellion. Politicians spoke of lessons learned. Scholars wrote of the psychology of control and conviction. But for many, the deeper truth was simpler. When dialogue breaks, faith and authority can no longer coexist peacefully. In the ashes of Mount Carmel lay not just the end of one movement, but a reflection of a nation's struggle to understand belief itself. Years passed. Grass grew over the soil where the compound once stood. Visitors still came, some to mourn, some to seek answers, some just to stand in silence. The story of Waco is not merely about a siege. It is about what happens when visions collide, when prophecy meets policy, when the promise of heaven confronts the structure of earth. Koresh had promised his followers that they would witness revelation. In a way, they did, not divine fire, but the human cost of conviction unyielding. The wind moves softly through the Texas plain once more. The story ends not with a voice raised, but with a question whispered. How far will people go in search of salvation, and how far will others go to stop them? Fade to black. Title card, Waco Siege, What David Koresh Promised versus what unfolded.